when John passed away suddenly in May, there were a number of administrative tasks to take care of, and then there was this ongoing slew of emotional tasks, right? And one of the preeminent administrative one was what to do with his class. And I am so glad that we had support from the Anders Center and from the School of Public Service to try something new. And this class very much is an experiment. 6 months ago, I would never have thought that I'd be willing to convene a class both online and with speakers from anywhere as part of it. So as much as COVID has closed off our relationships with each other, I think it's also allowed us to explore some new ways of connecting, especially from afar. And they don't replace the old ways, but they can give us new possibilities. So thank you for exploring this with us. Speaking of connections, few people have done more to connect folks over public lands and waters in the West than our first guest, Patty Limerick. She's the faculty director and chair of the board for the Center of the American West at the University of Colorado. And she was born and raised in California, getting degrees from the University of California, Santa Cruz, before she got a PhD in American Studies at Yale. She taught at Harvard for 4 years before moving to the University of Colorado in 1984. And her body of academic work is impressive and well known. I have no doubt that there are groupies like me that are on this call because they were introduced to Patty through this book, The Legacy of Conquest, which I read as an undergraduate. And it explained to me this West that I called home in all new ways. He's also the author of the impressive A Ditch in Time, which our reading for today is drawn from. But her non-academic work is arguably more impressive than this body of scholarship. Using the center as a hub, Patty has produced a range of reports and films and interviews, an atlas, editorials, forums, and a general principle that upholds civility and problem solving despite differences. And here she overlapped very closely with our own John Freemuth. And they had a like mind about the importance of solving problems across seeming divides. She's also served the greater good with leadership positions in half a dozen history organizations. She's been awarded a MacArthur Genius grant and the Hazel Barnes Prize from the University of California for her teaching and for research, the highest award that institution gives to recognize that. And so by all reports, she is a charismatic and engaging teacher in her own classes, and we are thrilled to have her here for our class. In terms of a little bit of housekeeping, we've asked Patty to talk for about 45 minutes, and then for our students enrolled in the class to have the opportunity to ask her questions either about the talk or about the reading that they did for today. 3 short Zoom rules continue to govern our community here. One of them is please stay on mute. We don't want to hear the dogs barking or the garbage truck in your alley, but we do want to hear your questions. And if you can't remember them, throw them up in the chat box and we will try and refer to those as we get deeper into the conversation. And then the final rule is you're being recorded. It may not make you famous, but it will be logged forever on the Anders Center website and people can come back and refer to this. So remember that as you prepare to speak and as you engage with each other. The one final suggestion, it is more welcoming and more friendly for us to see your beautiful faces as we listen together. So if you have a camera that works and you have the space to do it in, we would like to see you through the Zoom call. If that's not possible, then that is perfectly okay. Dr. Limerick is going to talk to us today about water is for fighting or deciding not to fight. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, everybody. This is what I consider an ideal aspect of life, which I didn't see coming 7 or 8 months ago, which is when I can, when there's just enough people so that they all fit on the screen, so I can see everybody. I think, oh, I'm having a lovely day. It's a wonderful day. And who would have thought in February that I'd be so giddy over the idea that we're the right number, and indeed I can see everybody, which is cool. I have been to Boise State a number of times, and it is weird to be in relationship to Boise State without getting to be there, because I have really enjoyed my times there, and I'll speak a little bit about some of those visits because I was given the license that I can talk about my friendship with John Freemuth as well as the the topic. So I know that this is a public land syllabus, and I know that that really is not much of a gap between a water preoccupied, water centered talk and a course on public lands, because in fact the two topics are very intertwined, and I'll try to be very explicit about how intertwined I see them. And of course, water is closely connected to every Western issue. There is absolutely nothing of consequence in the West that doesn't in some way or another connect back to water. And the choice that Westerners face between conflict or collaboration comes to a head with water, but that's also true of public lands and public lands management. So some of the ways that John Freemuth and I have confronted conflicts in water management and opportunities for collaboration are almost exactly parallel to things that we confronted in conflict or collaboration in public lands management. So I had a moment of thinking, oh no, I'm in the wrong syllabus. Oh no. And then I thought, no, that's not true. I have a right to be here. And given how much I am honored to be associated with John Freemuth, I would have claimed the right to be here if I'd been talking on, I don't know what, if I'd been talking on beer in the American West or something. Well, I could have brought in John on that one too. He knew something about that. So, okay, so I will start off with what, of course, is my main pitch here. You cannot go to a water conference in the American West, and I've been to, I think, billions, and you cannot go without some speaker saying, well, this is reminding me of Mark Twain's famous line, whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting. And they often say that because they are through talking, but they don't want to just say, I'm done now. So they just say that, and then they sit down, and they leave me in a rage each time they do that, because a little bit ironic about water being for fighting and me in a rage. There is no evidence that Mark Twain ever said that stupid thing. Mark Twain was much wittier than that. So he's certainly right. Whiskey is for drinking. Nobody's going to quarrel with that. But the water is for fighting thing, there is no evidence that Mark Twain said that. The Mark Twain papers people at UC Berkeley say they don't really have any evidence. They don't say, can't prove that he didn't say it, but it's not clear that it is Mark Twain's line. It's also not clear that it is particularly helpful or accurate when it comes to guiding us in how we think about water in the West. One of the things that is quite easy to do is to imagine what Twain, well, this is sort of lending our current energy to Twain. If Twain were here with us now, especially the late 20th century, early 21st century, he could have rewritten that to say, whiskey is for drinking and water is for brewing coffee to be served at stakeholder meetings in watersheds, which lacks a lot of the energy, I guess, of the other line. Well, in your reading, you have hit the pages pages 274 to 275, where I go into this rant about not liking the water is for fighting line and just not even thinking that it's true. And my wonderful friend Dan Lukey, who's a hydrologist, brought my attention to the woman that I'm quoting in there, Wendy Barnaby, the woman who was going to write a book on how water is the essential source of conflict in the 21st century. And then she thought, well, that's not turning out right. When she started looking at international relationships over water, she ended up finding many case studies where nations just had to say, this is too important. This is too important to fight. We really have to be in negotiation. We have to work with each other in some ways. So then that wonderful story in the reading, sorry to retell it, but where she says to the publishers, I can't write that book, it turns out, about how water is essentially a source of conflict. I have to write about it. It's about cooperation. And the publisher and the editor go, well, that's not going to be interesting. People want to read about conflict. Okay. I don't know that we know that, but if that's what the editors and publishers think, we're kind of in a mess with that. So I do think that water is the best vantage point for testing that question of when people collaborate and when they go into conflict. And I believe I will be making a particular pitch today that it is the best vantage point for observing and thinking about the urban and rural relationship. And I'll just say very explicitly that Western American cities and suburbs have been very attractive for in-migration in recent years. And unquestionably, one of the main reasons for that has been the beauty and the recreational appeal of the public lands and the landscape beauty of the farmlands and ranchlands. So the notion that agriculture gets, well, agriculture does get the greatest percentage by a long shot. In Colorado, something like 86% or 85% of the water goes to agriculture. I have been just recently, I was with a smart friend, a hydrologist who was working on a project with me, and he was just saying, we have to de-water the ranchlands, we have to de-water the farmlands. And when people do that, you just think, you do know that is the uglification of the landscape. If you really wanted to uglify, I'm not sure that's exactly a verb, but if you wanted to uglify fast, take the water out of agriculture and ranchlands. And it's really hard. If you've been at a presentation where people are talking about what it takes to reseed with native plants and to take a dewatered farmland and turn it into a meadow that might have been there before, it's really expensive, and it can just go out from under you. So I make no easy conclusions here, and would lose a lot of good contacts if I said what this hydrologist was saying to me 2 weeks ago, of just de-water the farmlands, then we have plenty of water for industrial and metropolitan suburban growth. Well, maybe true, but at what a price, and how confusing it is when we're looking at urban-rural relationships to think the cities grow because a huge factor is access to public lands and to beautiful Western landscapes. So that's one aspect of the urban-rural divide, is that water going to agriculture is an important part of maintaining that attraction. And then, of course, when suburbs and cities grow, there's an instant assumption that that's because the water utilities are facilitating, enabling, refusing to accept their responsibility to limit growth in cities and suburbs. Well, the water supply agencies, utilities, don't have the power to do that. You can read Denver Water's charter over and over and over and over again, and you will never find the granting of power to that utility to set the limits on expansion of land use. But it's pretty common to see good, smart citizens blaming the water suppliers for what they see as excessive urban and suburban growth. So if anybody, boy, what a wonderful thing for young people to take up, is go into that urban-rural misunderstanding, miscommunication, mixed agendas, and go with water as your main point. And a lot of things that are noise, I'm going to say it's noise to say Denver Water shouldn't permit residential expansion. That's noise, because Denver Water can't do that. There are places to take that up. Land use planners are certainly people to be talking to about that, but target. So it's a very fruitful area, and it's probably the main reason to intertwine public lands issues, because they are so central to attracting populations here, and water issues. Okay, so now I was told I could tell some stories about John Freeman. Okay, so in the late 1990s, the Center of the American West got money from the Hewlett Foundation to convene Western American Studies centers around the region. And I had met John before that, I think several times at conferences, but I had never really had the chance to be so steadily in his company until we had the Andrews Center join us in our convenings. So those of you who are young may not know exactly what it's like if you get a bunch of professors in a room who are going to collaborate, and who each of them I think that they were the principal lecturer invited for the occasion, and they're just talking. They're very nice people, of them, but they just talk and talk and talk, and it's not always a productive use of time. So at these, they're lovely people. I don't mean to be criticizing them, but I am criticizing them a little bit, I guess. So I always, at these convenings, we had 3 annual meetings of all of these professors from Western American Studies centers. I stayed in charge almost all the time. I refused to be anything but the moderator, because I thought it would just turn into a series of lectures and monologues if I didn't stay in charge. And somewhere in the middle of the first convening, I'd been watching John Freeman across the table. And I thought, he doesn't have that drive to hear his own voice that some of the other people here have. And then I watched him more. And then I thought, I don't have to be in, sorry, I'm going to go down from time to time here. But I watch him and I think, I don't have to be in charge all the time. I don't have to do that. So at a lunch break or something, I go over to John and say, well, we have quite a controversial issue coming up here. How about if you just lead the discussion on that? And you don't know how abnormal that is for me. That is really not the way I go through life, of saying, here's the baton, take it over, I'll just go sit on the side. But and I'm not entirely certain that there's anybody else that ever got that so consistently from me. And I'm not absolutely, well, I guess John would have noticed that I wasn't handing off to anybody else. I guess he would have had the occasion to notice that, but I'm not sure he ever got a sense to know how totally weird that was for me just to say, okay, I'm yielding. So, okay, so there's that. Then I have a story that is pretty funny about, I would say that John Freemuth always, when I was going to say something funny, he always knew where I was going before I got there, long before I got there. So if I started off on what was going to be a funny remark, he moved in ahead of me. So this is a really ridiculous story, and I hope it will be inspiring to you of the wild world we enter when we go into the world of resource and land management. So in 2006, the Department of Natural Resources, or Division of Natural Resources, I can't remember what it's called, in Idaho, had a big conference on water. And I was speaking at that conference. And John was going to be, I was going to give an opening speech, and then John was going to be the moderator of a panel, and then there was going to be sessions that he and I stayed through the afternoon. So it begins with me in a mood. It's mostly farmers and mostly people who supply water to farmers in my audience. So I get carried away with how great this is to be among farmers, because I hate my lawn. I just hate my lawn, and I hate taking care of my lawn. And I just feel that there are things I would accomplish in life if I didn't have to take care of my lawn. So I just, at this water conference in 2006, I'm just out of control. I'm just condemning the madness of people. If we were a nation that played croquet all the time, if we were a nation that played badminton in a meaningful religious way, okay, then fine, have lawns. So I just go totally all out condemning lawns, among other things. I have other things I talk about, but I cover that. Then after my speech, we assemble for the panel, and the first of two complications in the day appear. I think this has been so great having this chance, because these farmers all find the use of water for lawns to be madness. And it's a great area, urban rural tension. So I'm really happy I've had this chance. And then we assemble. John is going to be our moderator. And as he convenes the little group of us before the session starts, it's three farmers. And I'm happy about that, because they're going to be fond of me because I was so condemnatory of lawns. The first farmer comes up to me in our little groups. Everybody hears him. He says, well, you really hit me where I live. I think, I did? He said, what do you think I grow? I don't know. He says, turf for lawns, turf for lawns. And so I'm just, oh no. I never, important lesson for young people attending resource management conferences, you will be tempted to think, oh, I got the category here, I got a farmer here. Don't know, could be potatoes, could be alfalfa, who knows, but you need to be more cautious than I was there. So here's this man, we're going to sit down on the panel, and he is not my fan at that point. And yet I look at our moderator, John Freemuth is our moderator. I think I'm starting off on a bad foot in this panel discussion, and John will take care of me if it turns into a vitriolic fight over whether I should just be a better lawn manager than I am or whatever. John will be okay. So in fact, our session was perfectly productive, perfectly civil, perfectly fine, even though I had gotten it off to a bad start. Now, for the what a wonderful world, wild world of water management. The schedule was surprising to me. The schedule called at 1:30, we were to have a hypnotherapist speak to us. And I've been to a lot of conferences, but I thought, this seems very odd. So we go and sit down, and I wish I had sat nearer to John. I don't know what he thought about this, but the lady comes in, she's very nice. She tells us that water management is very stressful, and it sure is. And she says to us, close your eyes if you like, you don't have to, and I'm going to take you on a guided little trip. And if you choose to, come with me. So the water managers on either side of me, we look at each other with a I'm as cynical as everybody else. So we close our eyes, and then we get into it. We're in an office building. We get into an elevator, and she has us go down the elevator, and the doors open, and we're on a white beach with blue water and so on. And it's so ridiculous. And we all just keep our eyes closed. And then at a certain point, the hypnotherapist says to us, you can open your eyes now. And I think, well, it's only been about 5 minutes. It had been like half an hour. And the water managers and I are sort of going, wow, this is actually kind of helpful on that. So so that was an amazing experience. Then some years passed. Then 14 years passed. No, not quite that many. No, 2006 to 2018. And in 2018, I was at Boise State, and I'm giving a talk, and I at the water conference, and I mentioned this extraordinary experience of having a hypnotherapist there. There were several people at that conference, and they have all forgotten, including John has forgotten that we had a hypnotherapist. So afterwards, they're saying, we would never have a hypnotherapist. So, okay, so here is this great document. My archives will be at the Denver Public Library thing. So here is this wonderful correspondence between John Freemuth and me and Dave Tuthill, who was the director of the Department of Natural Resources at the time of the conference. And I come home, I look through my files, and I find, this was so great, I find that indeed I have the schedule for that conference. It's called Looking Back, Looking Ahead, Water and Energy Management in Idaho, October 24th, 2006. And there I am on the program. That's nice. And then it says, the agenda item for 1:30 to 2:30, stress relief techniques, Gabe Beth Brown, licensed and certified hypnotherapist, St. Alphonsus Regional Medical Center. So I win, and John writes me a very pleasant congratulatory message. He had also forgotten that he saved me from the angry farmer of lawns and turfs. So he's surprised by that, and he writes, so I moderated something at the 2006 deal, but then he acknowledges that I have won, and there was a hypnotherapist. You might think of it for this class if you want to carry, I don't know, maybe not. But then this is so excellent. I am not, I like Elvis Presley as much as anyone, I guess, but John then, having had memories recalled to him on this, then quotes Elvis Presley in this message. And I'm not sure how great a poet Elvis Presley was, but here it is. Memories pressed between the pages of my mind. Memories sweetened through the ages just like wine, which is a nice thing to have when you're thinking about John Freemuth. So now we're going to go into the water and public lands overlap of the most direct nature. And I will come back and tell a little bit more about various things. Well, I'll conclude with one more story about John at the end. So, okay, so water and public lands, how can you ever take them apart? Because in fact, the creation of the forest reserves, the first significant allocation of land in permanent federal stewardship, the principal justification was keeping watersheds in good shape. So it wasn't the beauty of the trees by a long shot. It was a forest in good shape will provide water to the downstream users, and that will be farmers and towns and cities. So the Gifford Pinchot regime, so much of that involved saying we must keep these forests in some kind of viable shape because that is what they have to be for watersheds. And if the watersheds are not in good shape, then water just rushes down and disappears, and it's carrying silt, and it's not what we want it to be. So the justification of watersheds is there right at the start. I think in some ways it kind of fades out of attention through much of the 20th century, but in the late 20th century, it really comes back in. And I'll take the Denver example because I know that. The Denver Water Board, after some very bad fires in the mountains that affected their watersheds, created a thing called the Forest to Faucet collaboration. And so it's Denver Water and the Forest Service working together on the original mission of the public lands to preserve those, or to keep them, not preserve them exactly, but keep them in healthy conditions. So water and public lands right together at the start. The reserved water rights, the Winters decision of 1908, which famously acknowledges the rights of Indian reservations to have water with a priority date of when the reservation was created, still a long struggle to figure out what those winners' rights are going to mean for tribes. But more and more over the 20th century, that reserved water right, federal reserved water right, got extended as well from the winners' decision to the public lands. So that's still not an easy thing to summarize, but decisions since 1908 have included not just reservations, Indian reservations, so that's the key and that's probably the most important, but also national forests, national parks, monuments, even military reservations. So reserved water rights and public lands totally tied together. Then there's that, whoever saw this coming in the distant past, the late 20th century, and the growing power of the concept of maintaining in-stream flow in the rivers. That famous figure, John Wesley Powell, who's kind of St. Powell of the environmentalists for rafting down the river and so on. John Wesley Powell said, we'll dewater the rivers. We'll do that because we have to put this water to use. So John Wesley Powell, if we could do some time travel and bring him back or bring him here, well, that wouldn't really necessarily be a kindness right now in 2020, but if we could bring John Wesley Powell into our world and we could say, actually, Major Powell, there's now this thing called in-stream flow, and we don't just dewater rivers. I mean, sometimes we do. Your vision came through. We do take a lot of water out of rivers. We divert. And we kind of came around and thought aquatic species really should make some accommodation for that. Fishing economies, recreational economies, rafting, we should do that. So Major Powell would just say, get me out of here. This world has gotten so weird. This is not really a verifiable historian's claim to be making here, but that would have made no sense to him in his time. In-stream flow would have been, what happened to you? What happened to all of you? Why would you think that was a good idea? So that's really something. Nobody saw that coming, and it's quite a change. And then there's the thing that I mentioned at the start, that the growth of Western cities is so much tied to public lands and their attractions, and also then turns out to be a very big issue for water supply in that territory. So I knew that I was at risk of getting too detailed and into the weeds if I talk too much about Denver water. I may have already done a little bit of that. There's the book, you've read the introduction, the conclusion, you got all that, you got Chip Sperry's afterwards. So what I have going to shift to now for my last 25 minutes here is several big propositions, really big propositions, that I would not even try to speak of anything involving the history of Western water without these big propositions in play. And I think they are almost as applicable to every issue of public lands, from the general to the specific. So it's just a hypothesis that may or may not be verified or may not get your ratification, but I'm going to try that. So there's like 8 or 9 of these big ideas that I'm going to put forward that are connected to water, but also very connected to public lands. And I'm not saying anything that I haven't said at Boise State before in some ways, because these are ideas that were certainly in play when I was visiting Andrews Center and taking part in discussions with John. So the first one is that this class is, and every land or resource manager, water manager is a participant in a giant international experiment. And the experiment is to find out, the question driving the experiment is a big one, which is there a compatibility between democracy and conservation? And at this point, let's cross our fingers that there is such a compatibility, but we don't know. We don't know. And every now and then, and I have been to the Mount Hoover National Wildlife Refuge a couple of times and visited with the people of Harney, so we don't quite know. The framework for this is a giant historical global framework, and it is that the practices that we classify as conservation in significant core meaning, reserving our present day use in order to have a resource for the future. Very simple, oversimple. Those practices of holding back some use in the present moment in order to have more still available in the future, those practices originated in very centralized autocratic power. So in the 17th and 18th century, it was colonial governors traveling imperial extensions of power. So colonial governors showing up in distant islands in India and thinking, having often being accompanied by naturalists who said to the colonial governors, this is amazing, the plants and animals here, this is amazing, but the local people are not being careful. The local people are just going in and cutting trees, and they're not thinking about the long term. So this is a very bad paraphrase, and I'm not exactly speaking in the terms of the 18th century, but many of the first attempts at restraining resource use and holding some lands for the well-being of wildlife or game animals, those practices originated in the autocratic power of colonial governors, backed up with military force in distant places of the planet, or in the estates of kings and aristocrats in Europe. So the king would have a hunting reserve and would keep poachers out because he wanted it for his own purposes. And the gamekeepers would restrain the locals, who were then not locals using resources, but poachers. So much of what we know as conservation as a basic idea, and many practices attached to that, originated in an era of very centralized power supported by force. So when the United States starts designating lands as forest reserves, when various efforts get made for thinking long term, to cut forests with some notion that there would be people in the future who might want to have trees to harvest on their own. Those kinds of practices come from a European tradition of autocratic power. Gifford Pinchot, the first chief forester and crucial figure, Theodore Roosevelt's pal, he studied with a man named Dietrich Brandis, who was German in origin and who was the British Empire's main administrator of the forests in India. So Gifford Pinchot learned his forestry from somebody who came out of this framework. So this is probably the longest of my points here, but just to say, that's where we start with conservation, is in very centralized power. And when we take those practices in the gearing up really in the progressive era, late 19th and early 20th century, we are launching this giant experiment to see if conservation is compatible with decentralized democratic public engagement and decision-making. Sometimes yes, sometimes very compatible, sometimes not so compatible. So it's when I speak to land management agency people, which I did get to do with John several times, I always try to make that pitch of just saying to these folks, you are extremely important historical figures. Every day at work in your Bureau of Land Management job or wherever you are a major data point in this ongoing experiment. And every time the public is shouting at you, you are really in this experiment big time, because you do not have a colonial governor who can come in and say, do what he says. So, okay, so that's the first one. The second one, actually the next two are kind of subcategories of that. So in our times with this historical heritage, it seems really important that we never take the phrase public participation for granted. And whenever it comes into play in discussions of the public lands, we come to a full halt and we say, what does it mean this time? So the environmental laws of the 1960s and 1970s had, not every one of them, but many of them had a real premium on this thing called public participation. And they were passed, most of them 50 years ago. So half a century has passed, and this conundrum, I'm going to call it a riddle or a conundrum of what exactly does that mean, public participation? How do you do it? Is it an advocacy group asking their members to send in 4,000 emails that are exactly the same thing? Is that the solution to if that's the exciting breakthrough on the democratizing of conservation, that's kind of a dreary way to do that. So that notion that public participation is so often required in decision-making about the public lands, and to a significant degree in water development as well. What is meaningful public participation? What is the relationship between the people who are going to use the public lands or the people who are going to use the water resource supplied to them? What is the relationship between them and the decision makers and the people implementing the decisions? I'm going to overstate my I don't know, I guess it's kind of a low opinion of the American public in some ways. I don't know where I would come up with that, but I'm going to say that in both public lands and water, the most common pattern is for the public to say, we want to get what we want when we want it. We want access to the public lands. We might want a concession where we can get some ice cream. We might want that. We certainly want to have roads that are workable for our vehicles. We know what we want. We want privacy and solitary recreation when we want that. We know what we want, and we want the public lands managers to give it to us. We may want to harvest lands on BLM lands or Forest Service lands. We may want to drill for oil and gas. We want it. So that seems like the common theme. Just as people who are watering their lawns, who are creating a new subdivision, they want water, and they know that they want that. So, and they are not really receptive at being reminded that they are not the only creatures on the planet. So the me first. And great discontent when they don't get what they were wanting, or are told that they might have to join a queue, or they might have not the first access. So anyway, so that to me is something that water managers and public land managers have in common, is many thousands, millions of exceptions to this in the human race, but a lot of people who are just looking at the managers saying, well, we told you what we wanted. Public participation, we told you what you wanted, so okay, let's have it. So that's, sometimes people wonder why I'm so empathetic to bureaucrats. I mean, the very term bureaucrat is thought to be pejorative, but my heart just goes out to them. And John's did too. John was probably even more, well, I don't know, it was never a competition, but there's a very bad habit that some professors have, academics have, where they go to a public lands management conference and they give a speech at a session, or they take part in a panel, and then they leave and they go back to the university. And then there were others of us, and I'm not going to say that John outperformed me on this, but he sure was my equal. No, then you go to the reception, then you go to the banquet, then you hear the awards and you clap for the people who are winning awards, and then you go to the receptions afterwards for that. But then, and sometimes you are very tired the next morning because you have to get up and go to the breakfast so that you meet more people. And so, and John was really in that, and I can't tell you what a difference that made for so many people to have that just hanging out quality. It seems like isn't it a wonderful job when hanging out is one of the things that you're most prized for? Wow, I hadn't really thought that through, but boy, what a great job you guys are looking for. It's wonderful, because there is really so much accomplished. It's good and it's important to go to the formal sessions and take part in that, but the hanging out is really important. So, okay, then the third point, which is also a subcategory of the great experiment with democracy and conservation, the great value of comparative, I was going to say study of the managers, but individuals and bureaucracy, the contemplation of their lives, to compare the lives of public lands manager and water managers is so illuminating. I feel so fortunate to have gone back and forth between those arenas. And sometimes if my attention drifts for a moment, I'll think, which conference am I at? Am I at the outdoor recreation overloading the public lands? Oh, no, that was not, this was actually somebody saying that we are running the risk of serious shortfalls of water in climate change. And I thought it was outdoor recreation. No, it's actually quite remarkable to see how those things all are illuminating. I would say there are more, just as a hypothesis, more differences than similarities in the day-to-day life of water managers and public lands managers. Really different content, really different expertise, but really similar challenges. And I'm sad that specialization has so fragmented us. So frequently, in Colorado, I have been the only person I recognize attending the water conference and the forest management and mitigation of wildlands fire things. I'm often the only one there, except for the director of the Department of Natural Resources, who has to be there too. So anyway, so that's a really great place to just be thinking about those people and their jobs and putting their comparative perspective in. Then fourth, and I think the fourth one is probably, I'm not quite sure what the counterpart is there for public lands, but I think I have it. sort of in mind. Anyway, so in the book, you read the section where I propose a great concept. I think it's a really great concept for the last 150 years or so, to call that era of history in the American West the era of improbable comfort made possible by a truly astonishing but taken for granted infrastructure. And it's been very, I think it's been tragic that people don't pick that up, because it's just, I don't know, you have to say it 5 times when you say the era of improbable comfort made possible by a truly astonishing but taken for granted infrastructure. The 5th time you got it down. And one really, really nice man in Burns, Oregon, wrote me after I talked there last summer and just begged me to write that down for him so he could start memorizing it. So that was huge. I can't tell you what an unusual triumph that was. Well, it's a good concept because it explains so much of our lives now as in a civil society, trying to be a civil society on this, that was astounding what happened from the late 19th century into the early 20th century in the way of the building of a water infrastructure, a transportation infrastructure, a food production and food transport system. It is amazing. The opening up by the 1930s of really quite workable roads to get to recreational sites. So that is amazing. The taken for granted part, though, is also amazing. And that, I think, is winding down. This is another hypothesis, that the taken for granted part on water, on energy, on easy access to public lands, I think the taken for granted part is scaling down. And I think that's good. The obliviousness and complacency thing, we tried that. And those are not values. Probably people have told you that. That as young people, you should not cultivate obliviousness and complacency, that is not a good set of life. I do know some people my age who seem to have made that choice, but we'll let them go. So, okay, so the taken for granted part is winding down. I think that's really good. And I think it brings us to, right now, a fork in the roads. If we can't take that infrastructure in water, public lands, access, all those things, we can't take it for granted, will we then take the fork towards more conflict and more breaking up into conflicting groups, condemning each other and pushing each other out of the way? Or will we say, okay, we can't take what we had for granted. This would be the time to really see what we can do in collaboration. So I don't, at this moment, oh my goodness, what weird times we are in now. So I'm going to say that I think all the parts are in place to go on the collaboration and cooperation road, which is different from saying that's the road I think we're going to take. But I think there's every reason to think we can do that. Okay, so just a couple more of these and then a story or two. So the fifth area I wanted to mention is that every day in the world of land management, water management, resource management, we are colliding with the people of the past. This is a little bit, it's not zombies. I'm not totally talking about zombies, but I am saying that the people of the past so structured the world of law in particular, and custom and expectation in the West, that we are just slamming into Theodore Roosevelt every few hours. Because Theodore Roosevelt did a lot to shape the West, and we deal with his legacy and hundreds of other people at the same time. But the people of the past are just all present in their actions, and they have created such a world of constraint. So in a very dynamic world, climate change being obviously a key part of that, we are not very well set up for adaptation and nimbleness in that, because those people of the past just kind of tied us up. And in many ways, they gave us a great heritage. They designated forest reserves. They created the Forest Service. They created the Park Service. They created the Bureau of Reclamation, for that matter. So they created our world, and now we are quite constrained in our movements. And that's good, because tradition keeps things steady and can keep us from unnecessary friction, but it is something to contemplate, that we have enough of a challenge dealing with our contemporaries, with the people around us, but making our peace with our predecessors is probably even harder. So so Jefferson, if we say to ourselves, how come, why do we have 85% of the water going in most Western states going to agriculture? Where'd that come from? Well, Thomas Jefferson and agrarian ideals, and the fact that Thomas Jefferson and all the major thinkers who created the nation saw an agrarian society. They saw a nation that had the majority of people as farmers. So that happened, that was the understanding of what we should be. The idea of turning the West into farmland, into productive farmland. Well, in hindsight, you think, the great phrase, what were they thinking? Well, what were they thinking? I just wanted, because I do like stories of this sort. So I was reading that incredibly influential text, which if you haven't read, you probably should take a look because it just shapes the world. Thomas Jefferson's book, Notes on Virginia, where the chosen people of the chosen people of God are the farmers, and so on. So, and the cities are a sore on the body politic. It's pretty bad. It's really intense condemnation of cities and celebration of, or pretty good, depending on who you are in that. So I was reading that as a graduate student, and I had my name listed. We used to have these things called phone books, and if a single female's name appeared in a phone book, that was just the hunting territory for people making obscene phone calls. So I had gotten up very early because we were going to be discussing Notes on Virginia. It was probably 5 a.m, and I had settled in to finish Notes on Virginia, and the phone rang at 5:10, and an obscene phone caller was breathing heavily, and he said, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" I thought, well, I'm in graduate school, and I should be getting new powers from that. So I said to him, I am really glad you asked, because I am reading Jefferson's Notes on Virginia, and I am learning so much about his ambivalent pastoralism. Yes, he was in many ways an advocate of the agrarian ideal, but you could see Jefferson at times thinking, that's not really the way to organize a society. And so I'm finding this tracking of he certainly is anti-urban. I see that, I get that. But so click, the obscene phone caller is just, I need to get out of here. I need help. I need to be saved from this moment. I thought, graduate school is great. I'm getting a lot of powers out of this. This is wonderful. So anyway, so that is just a funny way of saying we encounter with people of the past and they work in our favor sometimes, and sometimes there are obstacles. The sixth thing is what I'm calling the dead end of carrying capacity. That wonderful dream that just the natural supply of resources would be its own policy setting, legislating, regulatory force. So we would monitor and assess the supply of a natural resource like water, and then we would have the decision of what to do with that laid out for us. Well, no such luck, because you can monitor and quantify the water supply very thoroughly, very carefully, best engineering, best science, and you still have the question of the allocation of that water. How much to agriculture, how much to cities, and so on. So the notion that we would somehow or other hand over to nature the decision-making proves to be a misapprehension. And it was great while it lasted. The idea that we wouldn't have to be the decision makers, that was great. Now I have the seventh point is the perfectly obvious one and requires no time to discuss because it's so on your minds. Climate change and the loss of anything that the word normal could apply to. And the way I think water managers often lead in saying, it's not that we are going from normal condition A to normal condition B. We are going into a zone where that idea of now we got it characterized, now we know what we're dealing with, where that is going to be in flux. So we have so much, speaking of our predecessors, we have these important acts, the 1916 National Park Enabling Act that says that the National Park Service should keep the parks, the area in the parks unimpaired. Unimpaired? What does that, the presumption of that law and quite a number of things, that there was a baseline in the past that was stable, that was harmonic, and that we should restore that or recapture that. What could that possibly mean in this dynamic phase of climate change? So that's the seventh one. The eighth one is that things that really should be simple just are very irritating and not turning out that way. I'm just going to use the example. As soon as you start to get closer to actual practice, ideas that seem so clear from a distance in national parks, forest lands, and so on, and in water, just get really complicated. So the example I'm going to use, because it still irritates me that this turned out not to be so simple, it was so obvious that if you're concerned about so much water going to agriculture, it's so obvious that those farmers must be persuaded to be very careful with ditch liners. So ditch liners should keep the water going where it should go, and it should not just be dispersing out of the control of anybody. So farmers could use, the theory was farmers could use much less water in a way that would be very excellent for everyone if they would make that simple move of ditch liners. Well, then people who were smarter than I, much more experienced than I, started saying, well, there's a real problem with that the recharge to subsurface water from water leaking out of irrigation ditches, really important, whether that's discharging or recharging water to go back into to move underground and then get back into a stream, a river, and then go downstream, or recharging an aquifer. It turns out that you can be very enthusiastic about ditch liners, and you have to stay oblivious to the fact that there's a cost to that. And there's a wonderful book, you might know Mark Feege's book, F-I-E-G-E, his wonderful book on called Irrigated Eden on Idaho, and this beautiful chapter of how many goofy animals and plants colonized irrigation ditches and made it their home. So you're thinking, you're a very nice piece of wildlife. Why are you living in an irrigation or burrowing into the banks of an irrigation ditch? Or wildfowl that see reservoirs as great places to stop when they're migrating. So there's so much complexity in the seeming wasting of water in agriculture that you have to take that into account. Then the ninth point was the key quality of humor, and you read Chip's Berry and you saw him being really funny in a position where you wouldn't expect someone to be funny. We consider, and I believe John joined me in this, that humor is the WD-40 of social, political, cultural conflicts. You can get things that are just jammed up. You can get that moving. And I did have some limericks, and I can come back to them, but I need to be ending. So I want to conclude with a statement or two about John. So I had promised, I negotiated to get Cecil Andrus, Governor Andrus, to let me interview him about being Secretary of the Interior. John helped me in that. And the bargain was pretty funny. I was meeting with Governor Andrus, and he said, I didn't want to do this interview. Well, I certainly understood that. He'd put me off for 5 months. So that was kind of a clue to me that he didn't want to do it. So then he said, but the people here, I'm sure John and Mark Johnson, a couple others, he said, the people here tell me I should do it. But I'm supposed to, if you are not going to give the keynote luncheon address at our water conference, then I'm not doing it. And you made a trip up here. Oh, I'm giving the keynote address. I'm totally giving the keynote address at the luncheon. So I promised Governor Andrus and John and everyone else that I would be here, you're here, in Boise to give the keynote address. And then a calamity occurred, really big. So my first husband died of a stroke, and I stopped traveling for a spell. I didn't give any talks. Then, that was February of 2005, and then the Andrus Conference on Water was April. So the first trip I took after being widowed was to Boise to speak at the conference, because I had promised John and Governor Andrus, and they were both, and Governor Andrus, of course, passed away as well. But both of those people, if I had ranked the people I knew who would be kind and gracious to me in a tough time, if I had this would be quite a list to make. Maybe you should all make the list, I guess. But if I had just listed all the people who I thought, in a terrible time in my life, whose company would I want to be in? I think it worked out that way, that I had John and Governor Andrus. So that's one place where it mattered a lot to have been in his company. The course syllabus says this is about relationships, and it certainly is, and it should be, because that's what he did. John had people in so many sectors. Every Andrews Center conference was just filled with, I remember people who probably a good share of them did not much like each other necessarily, but they all liked and trusted John, and there they all were. So that was really great. And there's something that I can't even fathom in the last week or so, thinking about this event, that I am in this terrible time of national division. I am talking about a person who saw the world as a place for convening civil discussion. In September of 2020, I feel if I were a character in a novel, I would complain to my novelist and I would say, well, it doesn't add up. I mean, here we are in this, you put me in a plot where there's a national calamity every day, and now I'm supposed to think about this person who just didn't do that stuff, who did the opposite of that. So, okay, so here I am. So in 2020, we were talking about a person who convened all kinds of people for civil discussion, who listened to varying points of view and then conjured up reasoned conclusions. Didn't just say, I've heard everything and I'm not going to bother trying to add it up, but who added it up. So in 2020, John, we could use your help. And our only option is to follow in your footsteps and to read these great words from Elvis Presley. Memories pressed between the pages of my mind, memories sweetened through the ages just like wine. So I can see what, so this is an easy thing to say, actually. I used to be much more sharp-edged. I used to be out in the world of public discussion, speaking much more critically of practices that I thought were not the right ones and so on. And then I really changed course. And the phrase I usually use is that I used to be contentious and controversial, and then I became congenial and collaborative. And for some people's opinions, I became very boring at that stage. I became not as much fun. But it wasn't really until I had this wonderful invitation that I thought, well, look at that timing. So I got to know John Freemuth in the late 1990s at those convenings of Western Studies Centers, and handed over leading discussions to him quite a few times. And that happens to be exactly the timing, late 1990s, when I made the shift from the contentious and controversial to the congenial and collaborative. And I suppose we could say that, well, that's quite a coincidence. And I know that as people hanging out with or being environmental scientists, we must be very careful about not confusing causality with correlation. So this could be correlation, that I got to know John and I shifted my public operating style. That could just be correlation. And it is my own judgment because I'm in the humanities, so I get to make decisions like this very fast. I get to say, that's causation. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Patty. We'll give you a silent round of applause, and if people want to unmute themselves, and we can give you an actual round of applause as well as an emoji one.
Yes, I like that.
I think one of the hardest things is not having the sounds of an actual talk, right? The response to.
This is what I didn't see coming, is that many of you, I mean, I felt that you were not asleep. I felt that you were really there. And I think I could see that more clearly than if I were in front of a room and people were in rows. So I'm actually saying, I guess I can do without the, I think I'm pretty funny, and I do like it when I can hear people laugh. That's true. But I can see that as well. And I actually think that I might actually, especially when I'm not going to I'm not going to have the chance to meet you individually, in some weird way, this actually works better for my thinking.
Yeah, it's face language instead of body language, right? And that face part of it is much more intimate.
Right. It's so excellent that you're not wearing masks, and I can see the full face. That's really fun. There's one mask, I beg there's one person there in that, but it is quite an interesting thing. Although I actually think that our eyebrows are very eloquent. So when we are in masks, I think that we're seeing a lot there with, I don't know that I was such a connoisseur of eyebrows. So I'm really glad I'm telling you about that, because that's great use of our time. So moving on from my connoisseurship of eyebrows, so I'm at your service.
You can see the inside of everyone's room too, which is pretty cool, you know, just like.
Yeah, well, then, yeah, this is pretty, pretty much my habitat here. I'm sad that the cat has been a standoffish. She's usually actually she usually upstages me. I'll just say that. So.
Very good. Well, I appreciate you concluding with John's diplomacy, and we truly have lost. I think it's been in the world of controversies in the West. I'd like to turn it over to students, and we have I think it's Chris that's putting up a question in the chat, but I'm wondering if other people would like to use this opportunity to speak a question and to ask a question or to make a comment on what Patty's given us today.
Can I ask a question?
Please, Tess, go for it.
All right. Well, Patty, I wanted to say, first of all, thank you for sharing your stories about John. I never got the chance to meet him, and so your stories were very touching, and I was tearing up listening to them. But my question is about the career path you chose. I'm a biology major, but my passion is for Idaho history, and so I was kind of wondering what drew you towards your interest in history originally.
Well, thank you for that question. And I'm going to ask to have you introduced to Hannah-Lori Hine, who is the Idaho State historian and a former student of mine and a person who is going to want to meet you. So, and anybody else who'd like to talk about that whole picture there. So, okay, so the sad part of the answer, which we'll get over fast, is that I really was at the peak of the girls don't do science era. So I think when I was a young person, I was as interested in, well, science as humanities, but it was really clear pretty soon that I should concentrate on the writing and reading part. So what's really cool is that by choosing history and by choosing what we call applied history of going out into the world and bringing it to bear, historical perspective, our slogan is turning hindsight into foresight. By choosing that, I had to seek out scientists and engineers and have them help me. So this is the great aspect of my career, and I'm sorry if anybody who really, really loves math, I apologize for the rude remark I'm about to make here, but so I swerved somewhere around like 5th or 6th grade, swerved just to tolerating the science classes and then doing well in the humanities. And then I ended up in this line of work where I had better have friends who are ecologists and biologists. And they had better be willing to help me, because otherwise, as an applied historian, I'm going to get quite a number of things wrong. So I have friends in civil engineering who can help me with dam construction. It's just been great. And I got to skip all the math, which seems like a terrible obstacle to human curiosity. It seems. I'm sorry. I know that I know it's an elegant language, and I know that if I had had a different life, I wouldn't be saying this rude thing. But the Study of the American West has over 100 faculty affiliates, and a good share of them are in the sciences. I've been funded by National Science Foundation for a few projects with my science collaborators. So I am so tired of the supposed war between STEM and the humanities. That's over. That should never have happened in the first place. But there's so much need to be collaborative on that. And what I think is really funny, I've given talks to some of the science departments on campus, and if I mention the war between humanities and STEM, which you hear about endlessly in the humanities, the science people usually go, "We didn't know there was a war." Oh, okay. Well, then maybe it's over. Maybe we'll just move on that. And heaven knows that, just to go back to John again, that was a person who was, in fact, well, didn't he chaired the Bureau of Land Management's commission on science and policy and decision making. So he was the forefront. So that's the answer. And that is not an encouragement to be wimpy and not take hard courses.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Who else has a question?
Should we wait him out?
Staring them down on Zoom is fun too. It's less pointed, but.
Right.
I can ask one, since I'm not technically a student in class, but I'm helping out with Emily, and John was my PhD chair. So I'm interested in doing international comparisons with land management. And after your talk, I'm thinking, well, I need to probably consider water as well when I'm doing those comparisons. Do you have any suggestions on where to look and where to start?
That's a totally great point, because to a very small level of exertion, I have tried to read, oh, it's been 15 years since I was trying to keep up on studies, anthropological, sociological studies, often of international efforts to take the national parks idea and apply it in South Africa, or apply it in a coastal village in France or whatever. So I was sort of trying to follow that. And sometimes it does mean that that whole problem of democracy and autocracy come into play, as the native indigenous people are told to get out, since it's going to be a park and they're not going to fit in it. So, and every national park, of course, has the terrible history of the displacement of Indian people from that locale. So, but now, as I think back to when I used to pay attention to those sets of international comparisons, I'm having trouble thinking of where water came into that, or if the people doing those studies. I think the only place that I can say, oh, I remember it, would be with when the local communities were dependent on some kind of fishing, either freshwater or marine. But that's totally interesting that I just never, if I saw anything in those studies about the relationships between watersheds and downstream cities, and well, Mackenzie, it's great. Go for it. Stay in touch.
I will. Thank you. And again, thank you so much. This is
you're welcome. Thank you. But I'd love to know what you find on that. Because, I mean, I guess I'm just going to say it again, because I sort of already said it. But the world of specialization, that just became such a thing that we got, this is my territory, this is my narrow territory. And so I'm sure that there's very interesting comparisons to be made there, but only the hydrologists know that at this moment. And they must know it, because they have tried to do studies and make recommendations that involve dense issues of human attitudes towards conservation. So well, anyway, it's a wonderful thing. It's almost as if what we did, this is a really ridiculous way to say what your predecessors, what your elders did over the last 45 or 50 years, was that they built big walls between areas of knowledge, really big walls, giant walls. And now we are kind of climbing those walls and peeping over them at each other. And it's almost more interesting than if we had always been in contact with each other, to think, well, there's a hydrologist who knows things that I need to know. And so if we'd all been hanging out, and to use that great phrase, hanging out, which is key to interdisciplinary work, then it wouldn't be so much fun now to think, well, here's a whole body of knowledge that changes the world for me. And if we had not had all those walls, we would have just thought, yeah, of course we hang out with hydrologists. I do hang out with hydrologists. Hang out a little bit. I mean, I don't know why that isn't catching on more. It seems to me that the boundaries of disciplines are in some ways hardening rather than weakening. And of course, environmental studies and policy studies and all, that's a place where that just doesn't have any viability. But yeah, well, at some point we might take down the walls, but there's something fun about climbing up and peeking over at the people on the other side.
Yeah, and then tearing down that wall together, right? Finding out you have more in common than you had.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, in fact, I will say there's an interesting set of code words that I caught on to, and the biologist asked that if I went to the biology folks and started talking about the importance of history, I mean, they would be responsive. But if I just didn't trouble myself with the word history and said, well, I know we all want to really focus here on anthropogenic change. So the phrase anthropogenic change, code for history. If you're working with engineers, you can say, well, we must pay attention to that. Or you can just say, I know you guys all care a lot about durability. So we're going to look at some issues of durability. And so it calms them. If people get agitated, if they think they have to go into another area of another discipline. But if you say anthropogenic change or durability or something, they're just like, oh yeah, we know that. And then they breathe deeply. It's really important to breathe deeply.
Right. Right. We probably have time for one more student question. And if there's not a student question, we could take one from one of the other attendees at this point too.
I think, Emily, I think we had a student question in the chat, maybe.
Oh, yes, we do, don't we? Considering that we rely heavily on industrial ag to sustain us and even provide massive supplemental sustenance and international aid, wouldn't you say that we are agrarian reliant? Yes. Yes, I would say that. We are agrarian reliant. This thing about eating has just become very popular in our cities. Nutrition is just something that seems really important to our lives. What I guess I would say is that there too is where I would like the era of improbable comfort made possible by the truly astonishing but taken for granted infrastructure, where I'd like the taken for granted part of that to wind down. And I would like us to, just if we choose, we can't be required to do that, but just to walk into the fresh fruit and vegetable section of a store and think, good heavens, look at that. It's an artichoke. Where did that come from? And it's abundant. How did it get here? And of course, what's the energy subsidy? And that's actually what the woman Wendy Barnaby found, that in many cases where it seemed like water would be a source of international division, it wasn't, because, or people got over that division fast, because every time a carrot appeared in the other country's store, it was an agricultural water transfer grown in another country. It was a tiny little carrot-sized pipeline of water moving from one place to the other. So all I want is that, good heavens, look what we're doing, and how grateful we should be for some of it, but how we should be thinking, is there a better way in which we could be less, well, where we could just be more exhilarated by the fact that we have these products in our reach. And also thinking, this is very complicated, and I'm hesitating a little bit, because I'm not sure that small farmers and ranchers really are comfortable when I end up having to say, in some ways, well, your products are important. I get that, it's important, but it is your culture and your capabilities that might be more important. So there are not many of us who can fix anything anymore. So when something breaks, we have to go, oh no, where's the IT person, or where's, so, but there are still people on farms and ranches who, when something breaks, can say, yeah, I'll fix it. And so just that alone, I would, of all the things I want to do in life, going through calving season is not one of them, because I don't like interrupted sleep. And whenever I know when I hear the stories of what calving season entails, and I know that there are some people who would say, well, that's all the more reason to get rid of cattle and the methane they produce and so on. But I actually have comfort with it, what's almost museumizing, and that's where it becomes very sensitive with the farmers and ranchers. I'm pretty willing to say we have reason to keep small farms and ranchers, and I know that the question was about industrial ag, which is rarely on that small scale, I guess, but we have reason to keep that going because it reminds us, it's a museum. It tells us what we once had lots of. We visit the past. We are reconnected to the past. Well, I can tell you farmers and ranchers love that when you say, well, you're like an exhibit in a museum. That's so fun to be seeing you here. And yet there is that whole thing about agro-tourism. There is a whole thing of saying we're going to invite people who don't know a thing about farming to visit and not just get lost in a corn maze, but really learn where these products come from. So I'm really, I need to reread E.M. Forster, because I know that in his book, Howard's End, that novelist used as a key phrase, only connect. His phrase over and over again. I cannot remember a thing about who was who in that novel, so I don't know if I'm citing an inspirational novel or a horror story, but E.M. Forster kept saying, only connect. And that's what I think is the relationship that is not there for most agricultural production. And you rarely see somebody in a proper state of astonishment and reverence in the fruit and vegetable section of the grocery store, except meat. I really am just kind of, wow, blueberries, wow, where did these come from? So
I've learned this summer, as with most, that if I had to feed my family based on what I could grow in the backyard, we would all starve. So I'm with you on that constant amazement, because the 4 tomatoes that I spent all summer cultivating just don't cut it, right? It is truly magic. I have 3 quick announcements for the students, and then we'll give Professor Limerick one more round of applause. The first one is check the syllabus. It's continually updated. The Zoom call links will always be on there. The second one is that I haven't set up your folders for your journal yet. I'll do that on Monday, and I'll send sort of a recap email on Monday. And then the third one I forgot to mention last week, and that is that the Andrus Center has generously agreed to hold back one of their scholarships for a student in this class to honor John and your participation in this class. So if you don't know the Andrus Scholars Program, it's a $6,000 summer stipend for a position in a public land agency. And they'll set you up with the internship. There's usually a really rigorous interview process, and it's really sort of a foot in the door for this work that's so important that Patty's just told us about. So Tracy and I haven't worked out the details, but there will be one of the 3 or 4 slots for next summer will be allocated to someone from this class. So if you're interested in that, think about that, step up your questions, step up your game, get that scholarship, because you guys will be amazing stewards and thinkers for our public lands. So thank you for joining us here today. And please feel free to reach out if you think of more questions for Patty in the future, and we'll see you next week. So thank you again, Professor Limerick, for all of your time and insight.
thank you so much. Thank you.